Melusine by Lynne Reid Chapter 10, Under the Surface. At first, Roger simply felt keyed up by that irresistible excitement that comes with evading one's parents, of striking out on one's own, breaking rules, having a bit of an adventure. There'd be some bother at the end of it, no doubt, a telling off, some shouting, perhaps a minor punishment. Well worth it, obviously, for that. The first thing Polly did to celebrate was to remove her life jacket. Roger felt her moving about in the front of the boat and looking over her shoulder, saw her lifting the thing over her head. At once, the thrilling sense of freedom thinned as he heard himself say, "Don't, Paul, you have to keep that on." She threw him a look of scorn. "What do you think I'm going to do, jump out and drown?" "You never know." "Don't be so boring." "Well, I'm not going in after you." "Who needs you to? Anyway, I can swim better than you." Roger turned to face Melusine again. She had made a sound to attract his attention. She was looking alarmed. "Where are we? Why not to go with your parents?" "We're escaping," he said with a grin. "Échapper." But why?" He shrugged humorously. She dropped her voice and leaned forward. "You not like your father that you échappé from him?" Startled, Roger said, "Dad's all right. We're just having a bit of fun, that's all." She made tutting noises like a grown-up. "Tu es méchante," she said in a scolding tone. "Oh, so what? You can't be good all the time," he said irritably. She was spoiling it, the excited feeling, dragging him back to ordinariness and rules. Really, Melusine was strange. She was almost like a grown-up at times. For a minute, Roger wished Emma was sitting there in the stern instead. They rowed on for some time in silence. The birds were not so noisy here. They seemed to prefer the main channels, where more light came through the trees. Here it was deeply shady, quiet, remote. It was easy to feel that there were no houses or people for miles. They glided toward a huge tree that had been torn up by the roots, perhaps by a storm. It lay at an angle right across the canal, its branches propped up by trees on the opposite bank. But it was the rooty part that held their gaze. A huge round clod of earth, almost as big as the front of a house, with the roots sticking out at the back. They all turned their heads to look at the felled forest giant, and Roger dragged the oars in the water to bring the boat to a stop beneath it. It reminded him somehow of the gateposts near the chateau. Polly from behind him suddenly said, "Everglades." "What?" "It's a place. I've seen it in films. It's like this, miles and miles of water and trees with big roots. And snakes and crocodiles," she said with relish. "Prisoners escaping from chain gangs steal boats and get lost there. And if they fall out, the crocodiles eat them. Look, there's even the same spooky mist rising from the water." She was right. The heat under the canopy of low-hanging trees was now so heavy that it drew a steam from the solid-looking green surface, as if from a witch's cauldron just gone off the boil. Suddenly a bird gave voice, not a chirp or a twitter, a harsh, jungly cry. From one of the deep thickets on either side, Polly jumped, rocking the boat. "What was that?" she gasped. "Nothing, just a bird." "Stop jumping about, will you? It's scary in here." She shook herself and said briskly, "Come on, it's my turn to row." "We can't change places here. I'll put it in the back." He laid hold of the oars and prepared to turn. "There's nowhere proper to land. It's okay. I'll just..." She stood up just as he started to turn toward the bank, hit her head on the half-fallen tree, and fell straight out of the boat. The clonk of her head hitting the wood, the leap of the boat as she left it, and the loud splash caused Roger to drop the oars and spin around. She hadn't screamed. She vanished into the scummy water, and it closed now over her without another sound. "Paul! Polly!" he bellowed, more in fury than fright at first. Then, when nothing happened, his voice rose to a squeak of terror. "Polly!" Silence, the bird cried again as if in mockery. "Told you so, told you so." Roger's wits completely deserted him. It had happened so quickly. He stood, half-crouched, there in the rocking boat, expecting her head to break the surface, expecting it not to have happened. But it had. She was gone. He must jump in after her. He dropped again into the seat, his eyes fastened to the spot where his sister had vanished, kicking at the heels of his sneakers. But they came right up over his ankles. You couldn't kick them off without unlacing them. Well, Straight in, then, he stood up, preparing to jump, his mind ordering blind obedience. Do it, don't think about it, do it. Suddenly the boat leaped again. Instinctively, he clutched the gunwales to steady himself and looked toward the stern. Melusine was gone. He saw only the swirl of the green water beside where she had been seated, and something, a blackish undulating line, her pigtail it must be, wriggled, swished audibly through a turbulence and submerged. Jumped, but why? Fallen, but how? Again, desperately, he prepared to jump in, but something stopped him. There was some underwater upheaval occurring just below the boat that upset his balance and made him crouch down again instinctively. Something big was thrashing about down there. The little rowboat fell and fell as if the canal were drawing deep, gasping breaths beneath it. Roger was paralyzed with shock, with fear. He could think of only one thing, sitting there clinging to the oarlocks with white knuckles. A crocodile! Impossible, but yet a moment of utter silence and stillness of darkness in Roger's mind. Then there was a bubbling burst of sound. He opened his eyes and wrenched his neck, turning toward it. Polly's head shot out of the water as if propelled from below. Her face was ghastly, deathly white under streaks of glistening mud, her hair plastered to her skull. Her eyes were closed, but her mouth dropped open the second it was clear of the water. As Roger reached out and grabbed any bit of her he could get hold of, around her neck with one hand, under her armpit with the other, he felt her body being shoved higher by something unseen in the depths. This force, whatever it was, thrust her right up out of the water to her waist, so that with him pulling, she fell halfway into the boat. After that, it was comparatively easy for him to drag her the rest of the way, though the boat nearly capsized before he managed to balance it with his own weight. She lay at the bottom, streams of water pouring from her hair, her clothes. He threw himself onto her back with all his strength, and more water gushed out of her mouth and nose. He lifted himself, then fell on her again. More water was expelled. As he came off her the second time, she gave a retching cough, and then he heard a great noisy gasp of air rush into her lungs. It was the most marvelous, the most relieving sound he had ever heard in his life. He leaned back, sweat breaking out all over him as he looked down at her. She was breathing now, snoringly. She would be all right. He wondered if he should lug her upright or leave her lying on her front. He decided to lift her a bit, and as he was struggling to do this, he suddenly let her go again. Melusine! He looked around wildly, and at once he saw her. He felt all the blood leave his face. She was crouching in the stern of the boat just behind him. Her face was pale, exhausted even, but composed. She gave him a little glance in which concern and reassurance were somehow mixed, and insinuated herself gently into his place. She raised Polly's middle and pushed her abandoned life jacket under her waist, so that the top half of her body slipped downwards. Then she indicated that Roger should give her his life jacket. With half-numb fingers, he undid the straps and pulled it over his head. He felt the cold air on his back and chest where he had been sweating. Melusine took a handful of his shirt and showed him she wanted that too. He peeled it off. She carefully, even tenderly, dried Polly's face with it, then folded it and put it under her head so that she had a sort of flat pillow. Then she took off her own life jacket, and after it, the jacket she was wearing. She spread this lengthwise over Polly to warm her. Roger crouched there, unable to move. His eyes were riveted to the jacket. It was perfectly dry. He looked incredulously at Melusine, still tending Polly, murmuring to her now, rubbing her hands and slapping them to wake her up. Roger reached out his own hand and secretly touched the leg of Melusine's trousers. They were dry. She was dry all over. Her pigtail, which he had distinctly seen vanishing into the canal, was dry. She had not a drop of water on her. He couldn't believe it. He could not believe it. Then he thought of something else. She'd been wearing her life jacket. You couldn't dive underwater with a life jacket on. He'd tried it once. You couldn't. She turned to him, met his eyes. Her round black ones were perfectly calm. She put her fists in front of her and demonstrated rowing, then pointed at him, then back the way they had come. We go now, your parents. Like a clockwork toy that's been wound up, he seated himself and took up the oars. Melusine stayed in the front with Polly, who was now stirring and muttering and coughing. Roger was facing the other way, toward the stern. He began to row. That was what the clockwork toy had been programmed to do. That was how he felt. He was just glad he was able to do something. He rode back through the tree tunnel, numb. At the far end, near where he had turned off, he heard voices. He knew they were his parents. Soon he could distinguish his father's voice, then his mother's, then Emma's, calling out their names. "Polly, Roger, Melusine, where are you?" They sounded frantic. He felt the beginnings of an awful shame. As they came into the secondary canal and began to glide toward the sound of the cries, he felt Melusine's hand on his shoulder. Using him as a fulcrum, she levered herself over the oar, one leg at a time. He watched her slide down to her original place at the back of the boat and seat herself neatly, precisely as before, back straight up, head up, hands clasped between her knees. It was as if she were distancing herself from what had happened, which was fair, thought Roger desperately. It had been nothing to do with her. Only by the fact that she was not wearing her jacket could you tell that all was not just as it had been when they started. Had she been in the water, or hadn't she? He shook his head so violently that he wrenched his neck again. He must be going mad, that was all. He must be going mad. Or else it was the shock. Yes, that was it. He'd imagined a crocodile. He must have imagined all of it? He glanced around. Polly lay on her front, with her behind sticking up, her eyes a quarter open, groaning and catching her breath, wet, soaked, sodden. That horror was real enough. He hadn't imagined her shooting up to the surface when she was unconscious. That had happened, if it hadn't. Looking at Melusine, seated there, so dry and so controlled, he felt a shudder run over him from head to foot. In the blazing noon heat, he turned as cold as ice. And that's the end of chapter 10.